Welcome to Exhibition. And hello, Christopher Hodges.
Hi, Richard. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Delighted to see you again. And your exhibition is Under the Skin at Utopia Art, Sydney. And that's a wonderfully ambiguous title in so many ways, because it hints at that sense of perhaps a universality once you get under the skin. But it also has that sense perhaps that these works are meant to get under the skin of the viewer and prompt some thinking. What are your reflections on that?
Well, obviously, I do like titles that are ambiguous. I do like titles that get people thinking about what I was meaning when I said them. And so the paintings are made up with lots of layers, and paintings are all about, illusion. And so there's a surface, which is the bit you see, but underneath that surface, there's a whole lot going on to make it all work. And at the heart of all paintings is light, and light, travels in, bounces off the back of the canvas, and comes back at you as color. And so there's the physicality of that, which I particularly like. There's the irritation of being under the skin, if you like. And then at the same time, the idea of the skin of a person, the skin of the earth, the thing that you see on the top, that illusion that you get, has many references. And I hope that some of my paintings, well, that they already had at the opening, there was a good reaction to the paintings in personal reactions. One person sort of said, I'm going into this painting, I feel like I'm falling into this painting. And another person was saying that I look like I can see forever through this, there, something. And so simple reactions, but personal reactions.
As one walks into the gallery, there's a very clear sense of being surrounded by essentially abstract art, abstract forms. Can you reflect a little on the nature of abstract art for you, and how you see your works as being abstract, even though, as you say, they give clues to very specific intent?
Well, I think that I've always been interested in universality, the idea that things from different cultures and different people cause a reaction when you look at them. When you see a Picasso, you don't necessarily have to understand Spanish and French or the culture of those countries to be moved by that picture. Or the same way as when you see an indigenous piece, that the power of the work comes through. And rather than being a literal story or a literal photograph of something, there's a sense that there is something in the universe that binds us together. And abstraction seems to me an agreed medium where we all can talk about things bigger than just a simple little narrative. So I think that's why I've always gone to abstraction.
So for you, that sense of abstraction does extend to some of those universal forms. How do you find that universality?
Well, I think you've got to do your homework as an artist, and you've got to be absorbed in the world around you. You've got to be absorbed in the observations of life. It's exciting to know your art history and to know what's come before you, and it's exciting to I guess in the end feel an empathy with these certain signs and symbols. And then when you look at the work that I do, I think that you can see that you can find references and you can find empathy, I hope. And for some reason, there's a universality in that.
Let's go to a specific work, because you mentioned that sense of timelessness and universality, but also a sense of being engaged with the present. And if we look at the work Barcode, which is very much a motif of the present day and a motif of technology. But where's that intersection for you of that contemporaneity with the universality?
Well, Barcode is the last painting that I finished for this exhibition, and so I think all artists, their most recent painting is usually their favorite at the time of the show. Quite often it's too new and too different to go in the show because they've started to move in the new direction. But Barcode, if you look at it in one way, is simply that the grid of lines. But actually a barcode is never actually as even as the barcode in my work. But coding and sequencing, there's the sequencing of the genome sequencing that goes on. And then there's all these little pulses that run across each of those lines. And those pulses were compared by somebody that visited the exhibition on Saturday as like the ripples on the water when you're sitting, in the surf, looking just up at the surface as they come towards you. And then I can relate that to some Indigenous works that I know of by Makiti Napananka, where she talks about the ripples on the water of Lake Mackay. But those ripples would go back to body paint, and those banded lines could easily relate to Indigenous art in the white ochre, red ochre. And so there's the reference back into that side of things as well. And at the same time, you could whip it across to Jasper Johns, and somebody on this weekend said that it's like Jasper Johns' American flag. It's the stars are gone, but the stripes are still there. And so if you think about all of those different things that came out, that's, I suppose, where I'm headed in that we use the same method. The repeated linear pattern seems to run through many cultures. Every one of those lines is the same, and every one of those lines is inherently different. So I suppose it's like all of us, we're all pretty much built up of the same stuff. But we all have our unique parts and our unique differences. And I like that sense that that little ripple of the brush as it runs across the canvas makes something that's repetitive and resonant, but each one of those little marks is just a little bit different from the others. But together as a whole, it forms a universe. And I suppose there's another thing of mathematics that comes into it. There's a repetition of mathematics. There's a repetition of song. There's a repetition of dancing. It's all these things that seem to me to tie up in that picture.
All of the works seem to have that multiplicity of mark making, small marks repeated many times. Is that a way of accessing that micro to macro process, going from the small then to eventually the larger vision?
Yes, in a way it is. Making paintings, artists need to have bring their best game with them. You have to have your skill set. And all artists have their way of making marks and building up their surfaces. And, I've got mine. And to do my paintings, you have to almost have a Zen moment about you, because you've got to commit. Because once the paint's wet, you can't stop and start again. You've got to keep going. And in my head, that meditative process of putting the paint on is like, at one sense, great rigor and discipline. And at the other sense, it's a very strong and peaceful and pleasant motion.
If we look at two works where you particularly clearly employ that approach, West and Plain, two quite large works, there is that sense through those multiple marks of both light coming through, particularly in West, and perhaps the growth of vegetation or the geological surface of the ground in Plain. Is that what we're meant to see? Or again, am I just giving my individual response?
No, I mean, the work West was called West from the very start. I did a work on paper, and I'd been to Western Australia, and I'd watched the sunset over the water, and I took thousands of photographs of the sun setting over the water, because that moment where it just goes bing is it's a quintessential moment. The day is about to end right there, and so that is, you could say it's a landscape, but I'm not painting it as a landscape. It's that moment of light and dark. That's what was interesting about it. And then the work that I called Plain didn't have a name. That was painted during the bushfires. That was painted when the sky was filled with smoke, when things were changing, when there was a very subdued time. And I went to New Zealand to the Auckland City Gallery to look at several exhibitions with Colin McCartney run at the time, and saw his painting Canterbury Plain. And I thought, yeah, that's the name for my painting. As soon as I got back, I looked at it and thought, yeah, I'll just call it Plain. It makes perfect sense.
I'd like to stay for a short time with the element of the small made mark, because even on the sculptural work that is in the gallery as part of this exhibition, Courtesan, although the form is quite large and simple, there are many, many, many small marks made upon the metal. I'm not sure what the correct term is, whether it's a burnishing or a grinding, but how conscious are you of the importance of those small marks as you're making the work?
Well, the animation of the surface of my sculptures, it definitely stems from my painting. And the use of a grinder to make the marks gives you a repetitive, you know, that's the same little thing. As you drag the grinder, you can actually make little marks, big marks. So it's more or less drawing or painting with the grinder as you make the surface come alive. And so my earliest sculptures came straight off lines I painted on the canvas or on board. I painted those sculptures and then used laser cutters to cut out exactly my painted line. So coming back to the stainless steel work that's in this exhibition, that animated surface gives it a life. It draws on everything that's happening around it. So it can go from, if it's a sunny day and the sun's on it, it'll be reflecting and marvelous. But if the sun's over there and it's in the shadow, you get the nuances of all the different colors that are around it. And so that animation of the surface is a very strong part of the use of the mark making on the stainless steel. That's my painting on my sculpture. Instead of painting it with paint color, I just paint it with the angle grinder.
Let's turn to the circular motif in the exhibition now, because there are a number of works where there are still many of those small marks, as you mentioned, but very strong and very clearly delineated circular motifs in works like Well or Zero and Tiki and indeed others. But the circular motif is so many things to so many different people and cultures. What is it to you?
Well, because it's so many things, that's why it's a very resonant image and an ambiguous image, as you already stated. So in a sense, Tiki, if you look at the eye of a Tiki, which I did when I was in Auckland, you had this beautiful green stone with this red stone eye in the Tiki. And it's just not that far off. That looks pretty much like some Aboriginal artists have painted a sacred site in some of their pictures. And I've seen the similar patterns, circular motifs in just about every Indigenous culture at some point goes through either a radiating circle or a radiating square. And then in contemporary life, the dartboard, the bullseye on the side of a Japanese plane, the bullseye on the side of a British plane. I mean, these motifs are everywhere. Lots of flags, this big bold shape in the middle of a flag, the Australian Aboriginal flag, the big yellow disc, the sun, the moon. You can go on and on and on. Targets have the bullseye in the middle of them. So it's an arresting symbol that seemingly all humans have a relationship to, whether it's for cultural adornment or locus or focus. It comes up everywhere. And so as soon as you open people's eyes up to the possibility that it could be a lot of other things, it's interesting. So that when you call it well, people then layer on the idea of a well that you look into, and it's got that depth capacity to it. Or when you call it Tiki, then they start to wonder, what's that eye looking back at me? So it goes all ways. And
also there's that similar ambiguity with Zero, where it is both nothing, but also the process of zeroing in other words, becoming more focused and having a sense of purpose.
Yeah, and of course then there's the zero plane that the kamikazes used to fly on the wall, which had that, you know, the bullseye on the side of the plane. And so I think the zero is the idea of nothing is really quite interesting, because we all contemplate nothingness. absorbed in a world full of fullness. And so, however, when you really want to put awe into people, standing and looking at the moon, or looking into a fire, or looking at the sun, those are awe-inspiring moments. And a lot of those have a circle right at the center.
In a broad sense, do you see an important role for art in the social fabric and the cultural thinking of a community? And do you feel a responsibility to promote that? Because you're often very active in communicating art messages in a variety of forums.
Yeah, I do. I think the cultural wealth of our nation exists in our artists, and that there's gradually been an undervaluing of that. Economic rationalism meant that our cultural institutions were put on notice that they had to be businesses and run on a business model. And so I've always thought that the cultural wealth of the nation should not be thought about in terms of dollar values. It should be thought about on the value to a community. As a person within the arts, I've taken on many roles, but the role that's the most important to me, that never shifts or loses my attention, is that of the artist. And that I have to have, I've taken on other jobs and other roles in my life in the visual arts, which I've enjoyed, and they've been terribly productive. My life as an artist is still the most important part of everything that I do. And though my role as a gallery director has allowed me to see the reality of how difficult it is for all artists. And so, so I don't think, oh, look, I've been hardly done by, or I've been, what a shame that, this person or that person didn't come and see my exhibition. I know it's desperately hard to survive in the arts. It's desperately hard to go forward. And so in a way, I've got a little bit of a let out of jail card. And I think that what I do is important, but I make sure that what I do is meaningful for me. And I hope it is for others.
Well, I'm sure it is for others when they come and share in your role as an artist at this exhibition. So, Christopher Hodges, thanks for sharing your exhibition with us.
Thank you, Richard.